So welcome everyone to our inaugural Transplant Life Patient Summit. My name is Karin Hehenberger, and I'm the president of LifeBulb and the chief medical officer of Patient Care America. But I'm also a 3-time transplant recipient. And we're really excited to be here today at NYU Langone. And today we're going to talk about the state of transplantation as we see it today, but also about the future. Because although we're all so very grateful for our second chance to life, there's so much more that we can do. And there are so many more people who deserve these second chances. So I'd like to thank our sponsors, Sanofi, Eledon, and Memo, and also, of course, everyone else who's bought tickets and is here today, and of course, all our patients. We do have a virtual attendance, and we are recording this for the future, and we are excited to begin our very exciting agenda. Before I go through that and also talk more about the mission of today, I'm going to please ask Dr. Montgomery to take the stage as our host here at NYU Langone. Dr. Montgomery is not only a world-renowned surgeon and a medical scientist, but also a fellow transplant recipient. So welcome, Dr. Montgomery.
Thank you, Karin, for that nice introduction. Good morning, and it's great to see you all. Thank you for coming. We have some wonderful speakers. It's amazing how infrequently we all see each other, and thank you for bringing us all together, because it's always wonderful to see your colleagues. So this is, I think, a special day for many reasons. It's really important for all of us, both as practitioners in this field and as patients, and also our industry partners, to really crystallize around the idea that progress has been slow, and that transplantation is still the most highly rationed, effective therapy for a disease probably in healthcare. And I just want to underscore that, there's a dearth of therapeutics, but at the end of the day, probably our biggest unmet need is organs. And we'll be talking about that throughout the day, but only about 3 to 4% of the people who could potentially benefit from transplantation are treated with a transplant each year, which is an extraordinary thought. And it's equally extraordinary that we somehow socialize that and believe at some level, societal level, that that's an acceptable situation. And we've really done it, I think, because we don't really see another alternative, or we haven't until fairly recently. And we keep trying to do iterative improvements in trying to procure and transplant more human organs, and coming up with clever ways and innovations of trying to optimize the number of organs and their performance after transplantation. So Karin and I stand up here as 2 representatives of the lucky few who have somehow navigated this gauntlet of an existential threat when one develops end organ disease. And certainly I try to underscore my story as much as possible, because all of the, for the most part, allocation algorithms are based on severity of illness, and you have to get so sick before you have any chance of being allocated an organ, that the majority of people don't make it. And it's not just the 2/3 of the people on the wait list that will either become too ill to benefit from transplantation or will die waiting. It's the much greater percentage, the 90% patients who have heart failure, kidney failure, liver failure, type 1 diabetes, lung failure, who never make it on the list because at some point we deem that they're unlikely to benefit from a transplant, but that really is because we are in the setting of a scarcity. And if we could wave a magic wand and change that overnight, it would be a completely different story. And I think, unfortunately, because of that, it's really difficult to really get a group of people to advocate. I mean, if you think back in the 1980s, when the AIDS epidemic was breaking and the influence that the patients and loved ones of AIDS patients had on the development of drugs that eventually saved the lives of people with that disease, we don't have that sort of coalition. I think the lucky few who get a transplant, have some level of survival guilt, have a great thankfulness that they did have their lives saved, but also realize that someone else had to pay a big price in order for them to receive the gift of life. And so it's really, I think, difficult. Those of us who have had a transplant, try to get back to a semblance of a normal life. And so it's not a real strong voice. And, we sort of take what we got in terms of therapeutics and maintenance immunosuppression, although we all struggle with the day-to-day existence on this cocktail of drugs that we have that hasn't really changed very much over the past 30 years, and we accept that. The families of the people who donate the organs to us, I think the act of donation helps them to get over a terrible tragedy, but, then they're trying to pull their lives back together. And then the countless people who never make it onto the list or die on the list, their voices are silent as well. So I think it's a problem that we have to overcome. I will say that in the work that we've been doing in xenotransplantation, something extraordinary happened, which was the result, I think, of the day that the FDA had with transplant patients talking about what their lives are like, waiting for an organ, on dialysis, being severely ill. And I think that had a big impact on the FDA. And we now see that clinical trials for xenotransplantation are very rapidly moving towards a reality. And we need to keep that same pressure on the federal government to optimize the situation that we find ourselves in, but also to really focus on innovation, new drugs, new therapies, new sources of organs. It's critically important. And we want to really, underscore that idea today. So thank you all for participating in this. It's really important to us, to our patients, and to this field. And it's going to be, I think, a wonderful day. You're going to hear some really great speakers talking about things that are of great interest to all of us. So thank you.
Okay, well, that was very well said. And I want to kind of reiterate some of the points that were just made. We are here today because some of us have received transplants. And what is that value proposition? Well, I think we are very clear that getting a transplanted organ to someone in end-stage disease provides not only benefits for that patient when it comes to increased life expectancy and quality of life, but it also reduces the overall cost to the system. It's a pretty easy equation. So there's no debate that transplantation is the way to go for individuals in end-stage disease. But why are we here today? We're not just here because we want to celebrate life. We all do that, and we are very grateful. But we do, as Dr. Montgomery just talked about, we have a demand supply problem. We did a number of transplants last year, but we didn't do enough. We had so many people who were dying every single day on the list, but even more, as we heard now, 3 to 4% of them were just on the list. The rest of them were just not even on the list for many different reasons. They were either too sick or they were just not eligible for other reasons, because you have to go through a pretty extensive evaluation process to even be considered for a transplant, which sometimes really discriminates against certain individuals who just can't go through that process or are not even proposed to go into the process. So we do need more organs. And how do we get that? We will hear more today, but we will need to get more living donation, which needs to be educated around. We need to have more individuals speak up about how it is to be a living donor. I've been fortunate. I had 2 living donors. But the next time I may need an organ, I don't know how many more of my family members will stand up for me. We need more transparency in the organ selection matching system. We'll hear from Dr. Goldstein today about how to take charge of this organ selection process and how to get a better match. I mean, is it possible in the future to make sure that the organ you get is more perfectly matched so that you can reduce the drugs that are needed to reduce the risk for rejection? And then, of course, as we heard from Dr. Montgomery, alternatives to so-called allotransplantation. And xeno is, of course, one of those alternatives, but also, of course, artificial organs. So we do have that gratitude, and I think it's celebrated a lot. Gift of life, thanks, and so on. We are all doing that, and we should continue because our living donors deserve it, and those who have given an organ after they died, and those families, we need to celebrate. However, it's not enough. We're faced with enormous polypharmacy, meaning that we're taking 20, 30 drugs a day, many of us, and they do cause serious side effects. They cause side effects that are difficult to handle, and some people just don't take the drugs because of these side effects. Some of these side effects turn into complications and lead to actually causes of death. So the drugs that we're taking not only impacts our quality of life, they impact the length and the survival of the graft and the survival of the person. Many times the transplanted patient dies because of a different reason than their original disease, but a disease that is caused by the drugs that we're taking. And then finally, many patients feel lost in the care management system because after a period of time, when the very intense treatment and the intense care by the transplant center is kind of over and the patient is now facing so many different complications, they need a concierge almost to help them navigate. I mean, I know that the amount of planning to get to all these different doctors for prevention, for screening, and for care, it's complicated, and it takes up so much space in your head. We talk about diabetes taking up space in your head. Being a transplant patient takes up a lot of space, and that can lead to anxiety, can lead to PTSD and depression, and those kind of mental health disorders are increased in this population, and that makes adherence to medication even more difficult. Number 2, the second problem that we're talking about today is we need to focus on longer-term graft survival and quality of life. So the first year survival of the patient and the first year survival of the graft are great with current drug regimens. And we'll hear more from Dr. Cohen today about what that is and how we can optimize what we have already. But there's need for more. And we're grateful to the pharma companies that are here today that are attempting to get better drugs out so that we can extend that graft survival, because the reality is that the 10-year graft survival is no better now than it was 30 years ago. And that's a problem. It's a problem that the drugs that we're taking are actually causing an impact on the survival of the very graft that we are receiving and we're trying to protect. Something is wrong with that. And then, as I mentioned, the quality of life. We need to start listening to patients. When patients are talking about their quality of life, we need to be able to quantify that. And we will talk about this in the afternoon, how we get patient-reported data and large quantity of data now that we have extensive technology. And we can use machine learning and AI to quantify all these symptomatology that patients may not even remember when they're sitting in front of their doctor because we're intimidated and may not have it noted. That's something that we could start annotate and develop treatments against. So we need better drugs, and we need to act quickly. So we heard from Dr. Montgomery about the comparison with HIV when it comes to the patient movement. Another disease that is really, I think, an interesting comparison is cancer. So if only 3% of the transplanted patients now are actually being transferred, the potential market of, as I heard, was 3% of the total, that's actually the same size as the cancer population, if I do it in my head. So we're not as smaller if we could also treat all the end-stage patients. So the real population for transplant is actually the same size as cancer, yet we had one new drug approved that has a new kind of mechanism of action in transplant over the past 30 years, while only in 2023, we had 13 new oncology drugs, 13 in 1 year versus 1 in 30. There's something wrong with that. And there's also correlated to the funding. So the government spent $7 billion on cancer in 2023 and only about $1 billion in transplantation in the past 40 years. So where money goes, also there is development, unfortunately, and also where there's development, money goes. So there's, a correlation. And I think with all that, we need patients to speak up and we need movement. Private foundations have done a lot of benefit in many disease areas. I've seen it personally in type 1 diabetes, how now the movement is happening, and we're seeing for the first time a new drug approved in type 1 diabetes after many years. In private foundations, cancer has really been able to raise money, specifically for breast cancer, but also for leukemia and childhood cancer. And there's been a tremendous advance in those fields. But in transplant, the private foundations are not raising that much money. The largest one being NKF, where 45 million was raised last year. A very small portion went to transplantation. So we need to attract the attention of industry, finance, and philanthropy to move the needle. Finally, I think we heard it from Dr. Montgomery, there's a need to galvanize this community. We need to come together. The transplant centers, they're critical in providing the patient's medical and preventative care. But this 1 year metric is just hindering development toward the future. So patients feel lost, and we need to come together. And I think we see it in many of the communities. We see it in our transplant life community. Our patients lean on each other, support groups. And having these communities come together, I think will also be able to unify our voice and ask for something better.